Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and before we get to tonight's conversation, I want to remind people that, last weekend was the big hygienic, salon and music and all this other stuff, but it's really only about half over. So keep in mind for the next week or two, there's still a lot going on: Naked Canvas, Fashion in the Ballroom, the Mayfly Playfest, the Photogenic, and the Poets Cafe, and probably more. So we can see you around New London at all those events. Tonight's guest is Rob Barstow. He is a young green and from Marlborough, and we're going to talk about green issues and what it's like for young people to get involved in their communities and in politics these days. So welcome, Rob. Thanks for driving down to this neck of the woods.
Absolutely.
I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you was, what got you interested in politics?
Well, it started with high school with a global studies class where we talked about different political parties and ideologies, and we were talking about communism, and I thought about it for a little bit and was like, community, I like that, sharing things. That sounds pretty good. So I kind of became a communist for about 3 years in high school, and needless to say, I am moved on from that position because when I got to senior year, I realized that the economics of communism were a bit unfounded, and I prefer a more socialist, democratic socialist type of system, and hence why I'm a obvious Bernie Sanders supporter and now Green Party member. So that's really how it started. And then it's kind of been on and off since I left high school with trying to get involved in local politics, to doing things online, to trying other career paths, and now I'm here. So.
Well, it is interesting what you said about communism because, I was a practicing socialist at one point in the 70s when I was a kibbutz member, and that is not as authoritarian or strict as communism, but it's got upsides, but it certainly had downsides as well.
Yeah.
And so somehow it's easy to move, I think, from the left into the Green Party. And I also have friends who moved from real libertarianism towards the Green Party when they realized that an economics that's based on self-interest almost exclusively was not really the right balance either. So what in particular would you say resonated with you with the Green Party?
Honestly, they helped me out to run for my local office over in Marlborough, and they're the only ones who reached out, whereas the Democrats, who I kind of had been in communication with, they reached out a little, they seemed enthusiastic, but they just weren't as enthusiastic as the Greens were to actually put me into office for obvious reasons. So, here I am. I mean, it's pretty simple, honestly, not too complicated.
Well, I think that more than the Democrats or the Republicans, the Green Party does see that some people who are active in issues should become active in politics as well, because you can make change on a very grassroots level if you have masses of people pushing for something.
Yeah.
But sometimes it comes down to how the representatives vote on an issue, whether you can make progress or not. So grassroots democracy is a value of the Green Party. I don't think it's a value of either the Dems or the Republicans.
Yeah, there's definitely something to be said there. I've personally found that the smaller the party is in terms of from national level to local to state to local to each individual town, you'll get people who are more grassroots, more just trying to do a good job. But definitely the national parties for Democrats and Republicans, they're definitely atrocious in this country, at least.
Yeah, well, I think, many democratic countries around the world have a more parliamentary system, and I think that system, I'm not saying the United States would necessarily be better off, but it seems less polarizing, especially at the national level, because you have to
absolutely.
form coalitions.
Yeah, you actually get better representation. Like in France, they have a system where there's 2 elections. The first election out of possibly 6 different parties, and then it gets narrowed down to 2 for a second election. That way you get everybody's most wanted choice rather than being given 2 choices and then not liking either one, which is what happens in this country right now, which is not.
Well, the last
not
presidential election was really frustrating for a lot of people, that it seemed as though both of the major parties did not necessarily choose their candidates that really connected with the public.
Yeah, we got the shiniest of 2 turds, except we failed because we have the Electoral College, which is a broken old system, out of date. And now we have a president who nobody wanted, a very small amount of people wanted, who lied to get into office and is now running this country into the ground, slowly but surely.
Well, you mentioned the idea in France that there are 2 elections, so there's a runoff. The Green Party, I think for as long as I know, has been advocating, of course, for runoffs, instant runoffs often, but not necessarily, because you don't want whoever gets into office, whether it's a local mayoral candidate or up to president, you don't want a more than 50% disapproval rate.
Yeah, really. When you get elected into office, your approval rating should be pretty high. Unlike Congress, which in the last election, after the 2016 election, the approval rating was, I believe, below 20% for people who had just gotten elected. So that kind of shows you how likable they all are, and really what people are actually voting for, which is a more tactical vote rather than a this is what I believe and this is the person I think would represent me best. So.
Well, I don't think Connecticut is the worst example at all, but in terms of congressional races, the influence of gerrymandering just
gerrymandering. Yeah, don't even get me started. That is one of the
have
worst
time.
things. Yeah, we do. I guess.
I can get you started.
But I believe the worst example of between gerrymandering and a breakdown of the democratic system we have is North Carolina, which I lived for about a few months and then decided, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. I can't get into politics down there, so I'm coming back north. But North Carolina has a system where, from my understanding, you can only register as a Democrat or Republican. You can run as an independent, but you have to be registered as a Democrat or Republican. And then the amount of voter fraud that has gone down in these more conservative states, especially North Carolina, is absolutely astonishing, because they have systematically prevented a large portion of the population from being able to vote. And this typically comes down to minorities, because it is a bit of a race-driven issue. Especially the further south you go. But the real key here from the Republican Party on a national level is to suppress the vote, because they know that if the more people who vote, the more likely they will lose the election, because honestly, people don't like the Republicans anymore. Not after 1980s, when they started being funded by the millionaires and billionaires who just pushed them far to the right. So that's one of their key strategies in winning elections is suppressing people's ability to vote.
And it's funny that you mentioned that because a week and a half ago, when I went up to Hartford for our Connecticut version of the Women's March, people were pretty friendly. I was there at a table that just giving out pins that said Green Party, Peace Party, and giving out little literature about the 10 values. And only one person really was, screamed at me out of thousands who passed by. So I thought that was pretty good. But she was still concerned about, Nader stealing the 2000 election and Stein, in her mind, stealing, these elections from the Democrats. And, the thing I said to her was, we did not have a long conversation, was the real problem that we've had that got so much worse in 2000 was disenfranchisement of, tens, hundreds of thousands of voters.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the biggest issues. But I think there is something to be said that in our current system, how with the first past the post system we have, it doesn't allow for third parties. And it definitely, as a new addition to the Green Party, this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but I don't think the Green Party, at least as of right now, is viable on the national, and sometimes, depending on the state, a state election. I think it's a matter of math, not so much ideology, because I think if it were pure ideology, Green Party would have a chance, definitely a big fighting chance.
I think that's true.
But the math just doesn't work out. Right now it's Democrats or Republicans, and one of the things I'm doing within the Green Party is trying to build a base across towns, because I think local elections, not only can we win.
We have actually.
Yeah, exactly. We have won. It's possible, and it's also less damaging if we don't win. If we are a spoiler for the Democrats on the local election, it's not as big of a problem as spoiling a national
or even the perception thereof.
Yeah.
Because actually the numbers do not support that we have enough support to actually spoil anything.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree that I personally am so much more focused on local elections because, for one thing, you can win because, you can knock on every door in town. You can be the best person and get the word out on a town-wide level. Yeah. And it's still harder to win than at least in New London, a Democrat can win much more easily. It's not that much harder for a Green to win in New London than a Republican, because because it's actually pretty challenging for Republicans to win in New London as well. But partly I see the role of the Green Party in all the levels is to bring energy to the process, because you talked about the suppressing the vote, but we have a lot of people who have self-disenfranchised because they're just, they just want to not think about
that's
the state of affairs.
One of the biggest problems in the last good 20 years is that people just do not care anymore. They've either lost hope or they just find politics too divisive and, quite frankly, annoying and too much to think about. And that's a combination of many things. One, I think, is our media being a complete failure when it comes to actually reporting on real things and not just all the things that really spice things up. And then I think it's also a matter of the education system doesn't do it, I think, enough justice to get people that knowledge of, here's where you can find your local electors, here's why you should care, here's how it affects you. Coming from high school just 4 years ago, I know that, I luckily came from suburbia, so I had a nice high school, but definitely in the cities where there were it's just more people. Those high schools aren't as nice. They don't get the same treatment as mine, so they don't have as good of an education system, and thus they don't get a populace that is motivated or knowledgeable about all these things.
Well, we could go into like a whole show on funding of education
Yeah.
in Connecticut based on property taxes. That it's really challenging that there just is less money in the system to pay. To pay for schools in the cities because of all the tax exempt properties we have. But that's, but I think civics classes are, I don't know if every high school student goes to a civics class. I went to a city high school now in the 60s, and it was a really good school. But what was very interesting at that time, you didn't have the right to vote till you were 21. It wasn't 18 the way it is now. And I remember in my senior year in high school in a civics class, we had a debate whether the voting age should be lowered to 18. And keep in mind, this was during the time of the Vietnam War, and 18-year-olds were dying abroad. And most of my classmates were not in favor of 18-year-olds voting. And it just seemed so strange to me that, young people would not want to influence who's in power when some of the decisions that were being made by people in power were not really helping our generation much.
Yeah, there's this notion across the country that the older generations have more knowledge, and to some extent that's true. It definitely is more of a case-by-case basis. But as a whole, they also are more susceptible to corruption because they've been around longer, and that fervent ideology has faded, and they're more likely to just sell out because they know they can retire on a lobbyist paycheck rather than retire on a government paycheck of being, actually for the people. Luckily, we have some people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, who are taking up that call and actually speaking for the people and trying to stick to their ideals. But we have far too many politicians who just don't do that, and it's absolutely atrocious and is causing a lot of problems across the country and in some instances across the world, and it's too bad.
And in the state, and it is. I don't think it's always a matter of corruption. I remember at one time there, Connecticut kind of revamped its public health for low-income people, and they had this group that they were using for the Husky insurance of hospitals that people could use. And when it started out, they didn't have any hospitals in any states other than Connecticut. Well, people who live in Stonington, in Pawcatuck, they might be able to get to Westerly, but not to New London if they don't have a car. And, if you live up in Enfield, Springfield might be your closer hospital than Hartford. So it wasn't a matter of corruption, but we had this group of politicians who were a pretty elite group, and it didn't occur to them that they needed to provide options for people who might not have cars, who might live closer, to something across the board, medical doctors and hospitals across the border than within the state. And it was fixed, but it just, because in this case, I don't think it was corruption. It was just the people making the policies didn't have the experience to know what was needed.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I read an article, this is a few years ago now, but it was about Obama, and I think it was in one of his books, or a book he wrote, where he was talking about healthcare policy and being surrounded by those elites who have pushed that mantra on us, but also there's a psychological element where if you're surrounded by that and you're involved with a bunch of people who think one way, you tend to start leaning towards them and eventually becoming one of them in terms of your thought process. So you don't have to even necessarily be straight up corrupt to come to the mindset of these elites and the rich who have a certain way of life that's the only way of life they've known, is having tons of money, and they come to conclusions about the world heavily influenced by them having lots of money, instead of being, poor or working 80 hours a week and not being able to feed your kids. And that's one of the things that we need to restore to the politicians, and we need to root out that corruption so that we don't have politicians who even hang around these rich people. Instead, they'll hang around us poor people, so to speak, and really feel what it's like and know what it's like to live down here rather than up in their ivory tower.
Now, as you were saying that, I was thinking, and this is not, it's a yes or no question in a way, but it's not so simple. What's your thought on term limits? I don't think the Green Party actually has a party stance on it because, the devil's in the details maybe, but I was just curious where you were coming from.
Oh,
on
man,
that.
that's a good question. It's kind of, I'm going to give you a complicated answer for a complicated question.
I'm good with that.
Well, on one hand, I recognize that sometimes we need term limits because we have senators like Orrin Hatch and people like Jeff Sessions who have been in there God knows how long, and they just
Over
need to
50
get out.
years
Yeah.
in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, their entire lives essentially has been not doing what the public wants and being politicians. And so to some extent, I agree that we should get those people out. But on the other hand, I think of it like a game of chess. If we were playing chess, and on your side, you get switched out every 2 moves for someone else, then you're going to lose. Because if I'm sitting here and playing a full game of chess, I can do long-term planning. I can plan out my moves. I can strategize a lot better than you, who only has 2 moves, and then you have to pass it on to someone else, can do. And I think we need to find a balance. Personally, with the presidential terms, I think eventually that should be gotten rid of, and we shouldn't have term limits, or at least we should have longer term limits. But I think the first thing we have to do is root out the corruption, make it a more democratic country and a more democratic system, more fair and equal for third parties and big parties alike. And then we can start working on term limits. Because if we get rid of the corruption, if we get rid of the 2-party system, and we turn it into the most fair democracy we can, then I think a lot of the problems that term limits solve would just not exist anymore. And thus we could get rid of term limits, and we could do much better as a country.
I'd be interested also in just thinking a little bit about the length of a term for like House of Representatives, because I believe that, with them being up for re-election every 2 years, they spend 1 year of every term like campaigning for their next election.
Yeah, and that's a good issue to address. I think one of the things we could look into as the public is, first, obviously, publicly funded campaigns. That way we don't have politicians who spend most of their days making phone calls to get donations. And then 2, maybe even some sort of system where a third party within the government that's unaffiliated would do all their campaigning for them based on this is how he voted, this is what he said, rather than allowing the politician to have a direct access into that. I mean, something like that. That's just off the top of my head, so it's nothing I'm concrete on. But it would be an interesting change.
And I'm thinking, I think the nature of our elections is part of the reason that even people who are not being consciously suppressed in terms of their voting rights just don't find our elections interesting or meaningful enough to participate.
Yeah, that's a tough issue. I don't even have any thoughts. I can't. How do you
Yeah.
make the construction of a road system interesting to people? I mean, you just can't. It's just no one cares.
Oh,
Like there
well, yeah, except,
engineers care, and that's actually you know
Yeah,
what
but-
that leads me to
Yeah.
whole another can of worms, which is that we should be getting rid of politicians and putting in engineers, scientists, people who know what they're doing and do it based on outcomes, not based on politics. I trust a group of engineers to design a road system and to design a layout of a city about 10 times more than I would trust a group of politicians who are trying to do the best for the people, but they each have their own priorities because ideologies are different all around, and they also aren't engineers who are going to make the most efficient system. So I would be for moving us towards a more technocratic government, one that is based with scientists and engineers and people who study the field that they're trying to work on, rather than politicians who have good ideas in mind for their constituents, but don't necessarily know how to effectively run a system.
And unfortunately, we're like in the very lowest point right now of that in terms of our national administration, because even the cabinet, the department heads in the past have often been selected because of their expertise in, in infrastructure or in food system or in human services or in education. And now the people who were installed in those positions really don't know anything.
Yeah, and in fact, they're specifically picked because they don't know anything.
Yeah.
Like the people who are put on the Board of Education for the
Betsy
country.
DeVos
Betsy
is,
DeVos is specifically against public education. She has been her entire life, and that's her entire purpose of being put on that section of the government, is because she wants to destroy it and cripple it. And that's the conservative mantra for the past 20 years or so, probably more.
probably since Reagan's
Yeah,
here,
honestly,
since the
probably
80s.
since Reagan, has been just put people on into positions where they can do the most damage to destroy that system, because they just don't want it, whether it's an ideological thing or a corruption thing. They just don't want these systems in place.
So let's talk a little bit about some issues. And I guess we can go a few directions from this, but we've been seeing the influence of some people's religious beliefs on political policy, and that's manifested in a few different places. So do you want to talk about your thoughts on what our policies need to be and where religion should be and where it shouldn't be?
Well, religion should not be in the realm of public policy at all. It has no business. You want to be religious? That's fine. I might disagree. Muslim might disagree with a Christian on certain ideological lines, but you keep it at home, keep it in the church, and don't go into government with that, because last time I checked, we're not a theocracy, we're a democracy. So.
Or supposed to be.
Yeah, we're supposed to be. We're like an oligarchy, but,
So specifically, and I'm thinking of this because, of the Women's March happening, in my near memory, reproductive rights was a huge issue that came up in different ways there. How can we move forward, and what do you think our laws should look like?
They should look
No.
like, one, we need better sex education. One of the reasons we have things like teen pregnancy and STD transfers is because we don't have good sex education across the country. Some states have good education, some states don't, some towns do, some towns don't. We need to make that unilateral and make sure that everyone gets good sex education, because if you know about STDs, how to prevent them, how to use birth control, where to get it, and all that, then you're going to have less pregnancies, you're going to have less, which turns into less abortions for all you pro-lifers out there. It becomes a much safer place to be when everyone knows what they're doing. And we don't have kids running around who don't understand prevention of STDs or that if you have a kid, then that's going to cost you lots of money and basically keep you tied down for the rest of your life, and there goes any hopes and dreams you had. If you're unprepared, that is. But that's the first step. Second step is we need to bolster our health clinics, things like Planned Parenthood, which does a very small amount of actual abortions, or rather the referencing of giving out doctors who can perform it, because they don't actually do it on site for most of them, as far as I know. And we need to start funding that instead of funding a bunch of military bases in Germany and across Europe that we have no business being in. We should be funding making sure our citizens of this country have a good health system. Things like, and that ties into healthcare.
It does.
When you have Plan B and Planned Parenthood and funded and out there and open, then you actually prevent a lot of problems other than anything to do with babies. You prevent a lot of cancers and other medical effects, and thus the cost of healthcare for everyone goes down. And then we need to just be okay with people choosing to have an abortion or not. You know, if I want, well, I'm a guy, so I guess maybe not but if a woman wants to remove a few cells from her body because she knows that in 9 months that those group of cells are going to turn into a human baby, which will cost her like $30,000 just to have, not to feed or clothe or have at home, just to have in a hospital in this country. I found that out just tonight. Then we need to be able to have a system in place that allows her to make the choice to not have that baby and not feel guilty about it because a bunch of religious nuts, because it's most of them, not everyone who's pro-choice, but a lot of them, telling her that she doesn't get to choose what she does with her body before that group of cells has a nervous system or develops spinal cord or brain. We're talking about, I personally am for abortion before, I believe it's the 22-week mark, which is before the nervous system develops, thus whatever's in there will feel no pain when it's removed. After that, I think it should be allowed in cases where it affects the health of the mother. If she's going to die because of it, a fatal flaw or something goes wrong, then she should be able to, but otherwise it should be open game before that nervous system. But
So what I was thinking about as you were talking is one of the things that has always appealed to me with the Green Party is that the party is in favor of universal health care so that people can get the medical care they want without worrying about losing their house or, going into such extreme medical debt that they can't even ever think of buying a house.
Yeah.
So you create a healthcare system that covers everyone. You create reproductive health care systems that cover everyone who needs. And then after all of these things are in place to help people survive without it being a tremendous burden, then ultimate decisions are devolved back to the individual who's going to be most affected by them.
Yeah.
And on the other end of the abortion issue is the end of life issues as well.
Euthanasia.
And I, at a past show, I had people from a Connecticut atheist group, and one of the issues that they work on is, people having, the right to die if they are of sound mind, and, that's their decision, and have it made, people getting individual choice without having the religious beliefs of others influence whether they have the choice or not.
And that's a great topic. Euthanasia is one of those things that it's sad that someone would choose to take their own life at that point, but keeping them alive, forcing them or not allowing them to take that life is arguably worse, because that is torture. If in some cases, if in a case of someone who's got a brain tumor and they're in dire pain every day and they just want to end it because it's terminal anyway, then why should they not have the choice to just end the pain? And at the end of the day, if you tell them, no, you can't have that option, you're not a good Christian or good whatever, insert faith here. You're just a person who doesn't care about people's actual feelings. You just, and when it comes to family or close friends, you're just selfish if you want them to be alive just so you can, feel good and not be sad when they're in dire pain. And it's really disgusting when I hear about people who are so against it for seemingly no reason, no good reason at least.
So let's see. I think staying along this line of, we want to create structures in our society that will reduce the pain that people, will drive people to feel like they need to take desperate measures. Mm-hmm. But also give people that right. We haven't actually had a chance to talk about economic issues, and I'm pretty lucky. I'm not suffering a lot of financial stress, though I'm certainly not wealthy. But I know a lot of people now whose lives have really been consumed by their not being able to survive, barely having, being able to pay for suitable housing, suitable nutrition, health care on what they're earning. I'm talking about people who do have jobs. So what are your thoughts on our economic system and what we can do better?
Well, that would be everything. We could do everything better, because right now we have a system that benefits the top 1%, top 10%, top 1% of 1%, and screws the rest of us. And we need to better that, and we can better that with a lot of different policies, one of which is healthcare, as we talked earlier, because when you take away the middleman of health insurance companies and just make it a more efficient system, you give people more money to go spend at McDonald's or at their local farmer's market or at the toy store or on video games, whatever it may be, because they don't have to then spend that money on dealing with pain in their foot that could easily be dealt with a simple prescription, and then $5,000 later, they've now got complications because they couldn't pay for full treatment, and they're going into debt because of some stupid thing in their foot, or whatever it may be, that they could have dealt with like that. And so that's one thing, first thing. Second thing would be minimum wage. If you work 40 hours a week, you should not be in poverty. And across this country, we have a base minimum wage federally of, I believe, $7.25, is it?
Really low.
Which is, so bad. When I moved to North Carolina, one of the downfalls of that move was that the minimum wage was much lower. So, and I essentially moved out. I had a roommate down there and paying for an apartment, and I was on, luckily I was able to find a job with above minimum wage, but it wasn't too great, and it did not leave me a lot of money for spending elsewhere after paying for things like rent and food and gas in my car. It didn't leave me much for actual spending money, let alone saving money for, God forbid, I had a medical emergency. I would have been in debt, I would have been stuck in North Carolina, and my life would be essentially over, at least for the most part. So we need to raise the minimum wage so that across the board, so that it is tied to inflation, productivity, and most importantly, the region. If for a lower costing place to live, like some places down south are, even North Carolina, it's a low cost of living compared to a place like Connecticut. So their minimum wage doesn't have to necessarily be the same as ours, but it should be higher than $7.25.
I know. I read recently that there is no state in the country where minimum wage will be able to pay for housing at market rate prices.
Yeah, I mean, that's atrocious. If you work 40 hours a week, you should be able to pay for an apartment and pay for other things, luxury goods, whatever it is. And you should actually be able to live a life if you work 40 hours a week. And one of the things in regards to minimum wage that people always say on the right is, oh, well, the poor people don't pay you. They don't pay your paycheck. It's the rich. So you have to be able to continually fund them money. But who pays the rich's paycheck? Well, it's the poor person who's buying their goods at a store. You know, if 10 people walk into a McDonald's, each buy a burger, but only one rich person does, well, then it's clearly the poor people who are paying and giving more money to McDonald's to eventually pay that person's paycheck. So when you have, like I work at a Dunkin' Donuts, if you have all the Dunkin' employees working at $15 an hour, or higher than what it is now, then they have more spending money to go to other fast food places, or even the same fast food they work at, or use whatever they want to buy, and they will put their money into other businesses. Those businesses will grow, and because those businesses will also pay their employees more, then those employees might go to Dunkin' more, and everybody benefits from having a higher minimum wage, except maybe the people who just want to hoard millions of dollars in offshore bank accounts and just sit on it. Looking at you, Trump. And I mean, everyone benefits from a minimum wage. It's not going to take away your jobs. It's not going to prevent you from getting a job. It's going to help everyone.
And I think one of the flaws we've seen with trickle-down economics was, at a certain point, if you're a big company or a small company making a product, you need people who can afford to use that product.
Yeah. Exactly.
And
If-
it can't just be a very small percent. Um, so Connecticut, and we only have about 5 minutes left. Connecticut is the state, one of the states with the biggest wealth gap in the country. So what are your thoughts on what Connecticut could do economically to equalize things a little, since we've talked about how the huge wealth gaps don't work?
Well, I think one is we need to increase our minimum wage. We've been doing it recently. A few years ago we got it up to 10.10 an hour, and that was a good start. We need to keep on increasing that to at the very least 15. I would say max is about $22 an hour, which would simply be keeping up with productivity levels from 1970s.
Yeah, I think it was the 70s when productivity increases started going
Yeah.
to the owners and not to the workers.
Yeah, and that's a big part of the whole money in politics thing. And one of the big issues we need to do for Connecticut and all states to actually get a higher minimum wage, and at the end of the day, better economics, is get money out of politics, and that's where you, the viewer, comes in, and we come in, and that is going out there and actually taking part in local elections, and that is getting involved in the community and really fighting for what you believe in, and telling everyone you have a voice. Don't just sit in the shadows because you're tired of politics, or you're just bored, or it just doesn't interest you. Take part. It's your community. It's your life. I have people at Duncan I've talked to who just have no interest in voting, and they said if they were forced to vote, they would vote for joke people. And look, what the heck? That's not correct. We're not gonna go anywhere as a country if we just have people who screw around in politics and don't actually take part. I'm not saying go out and run for something, but at the very least, educate yourself and go vote.
Now, you recently got a position on one of the boards in Marlborough, and we only have 2 minutes, I'm told, but what has been very quickly your experience with a young person just getting appointed to a board?
Well, the Democrats in my town definitely were a little peeved at that. So, because in the first meeting, I was walking in, and the first selectman, who's one of the Democrats I reached out to back in the day, she was like, "Aren't you Rob? Oh, you are? Ah, you snuck in there," and you could feel the resentment coming from her voice. But so far, it's honestly been kind of boring. I haven't done much. We've had one meeting so far, but I look forward to more in the future, and I hope to learn a lot. So.
Do you have any other final thoughts on other things young people in particular could do to get involved?
Yes. As I said before, go educate yourself. I would recommend shows on YouTube like Majority Report with Sam Cedar, Secular Talk with Kyle Kalinske, the Young Turks Network, and just get a wide variety of talk shows and listen to actual policies that go on, and then go use that knowledge and vote.
Well, thank you, Rob, for coming down to New London.
Thank you.
Maybe we'll be seeing more of you.
Hopefully.
Next week, our guest will be a local artist, Mike Alowitz, who has been involved in a mural project on the Separation Wall, which should be really interesting. So thanks again, Rob, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Africa, nimependa dreaming.